Hi everyone. For my project, I chose option one, where I'll be comparing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein with Kenneth Branagh's 1994 film adaptation of Frankenstein. Both Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Branagh's 1994 adaptation reimagine creation through the lens of motherhood and loss. They're using the lens of Ellen Moore's idea of the female gothic, in which women's bodily experiences of birth, death, and grief become sources of horror. This comparative analysis argues that Shelley transforms her maternal trauma into Gothic literary art, while Branagh visualizes it and even dramatizes that maternal horror through the death of Victor's mother in childbirth and the grotesque spectacle of the creature's birth scene. So here are some pictures of the various characters as depicted by Branagh in his film adaptation. So we actually have Kenneth Branagh himself as Victor Frankenstein on the bottom. And then in the top left, you can see Robert De Niro as the creature. And a major difference in Branagh's adaptation is the much larger part that Elizabeth has in the plot. And so we have Helena Bonham Carter up in the top right as Elizabeth Lavenza. And the reason she looks as she does is because Victor actually reanimates her, unlike in the novel. But in an act of reclaiming her autonomy, so like Victor and the creature were like fighting over her, like who gets to be with her after she's reanimated, and she actually destroys herself by self-immolation. Diving more into the female Gothic, if I were creating like a full comparative analysis, I would go more into Shelley's background and the loss of her infant, and also her mother through childbirth, and also in the ways that like she published her work anonymously at first, and like what that means as a woman, and also the multitude of surnames that she had. And that just kind of made her more identified through the males in her life rather than as like an individual. And something really interesting in Moore's argument that I think would also fit in well with, I believe it was Halberstam, is how the female Gothic gets to the body itself, its glands, epidermis, muscles, and circulatory system, quickly allaying the physical reactions to fear. So it's just that really like visceral horror with this kind of Gothic narrative. Another thing to note is that the patriarchal form, so like going back to how Shelley published her work anonymously, 18th and 19th century novels reinforced male-centered order, and like women's voices were regulated. So that probably had a lot to do with her publishing anonymously, and also how she chose Victor Frankenstein as like a male character, like centered around him rather than a female character like herself. Another thing to note is that Branagh's adaptation closely follows Shelley's novel. Like it was very similar in a lot of ways, even including the frame narrative that Shelley had set up in Frankenstein. But he did take some creative liberties to dramatize it for the modern audience. And one of those things was like the romance between kind of like a love triangle between Frankenstein and the creature and Elizabeth. And also something that I like about the film is how it really like kind of dramatizes, but it also explains Victor's obsession with creating life. And Branagh chooses, instead of instead of Victor's mother dying from scarlet fever, Branagh chooses to have her die in childbirth, which kind of makes more sense to the storyline why Victor would be so obsessed with like bringing someone back to life. When comparing the themes of maternal trauma and also centering like around the birth scene in both the film and the novel, Moore's article, and also there was one by Lepore, and both of these really dive into Shelley's experience of motherhood, and childbirth, and also like loss, and how that's like central to her imagination of this type of like unnatural form of like birth and creation. Another thing is like Victor's revulsion after giving birth to the creature, after 2 years of like a metaphorical and like quite literal labor. We have this quote from the novel, where he was filled with like horror and disgust after seeing what he created, and that kind of like ties in with like what's the word for it, like a postpartum feelings potentially. And another thing to note is like the absence of women in the act of creation and how that reveals the gothic like patriarchal anxieties about the extent of women's power in being able to create life naturally, and also like what that means for women. Like if men had the ability to create life, like would that make women no longer necessary or useful, like at least within the like Victorian ideal of male superiority. And we have this quote from Moore's that Frankenstein defies mortality not by living forever, but by giving birth. So just, another thing there about birth. And some interesting choices that Branagh made in his visualization of the creation was the use of like amniotic fluid to like as the secret ingredient, I guess, to be able to bring life to the creature. And there were some other choices, like I think there was like a heartbeat that you could hear, and then there's like the umbilical imagery of like all the tubes and cords and stuff like coming out of the like mechanical womb that the creature is inside. So it's like a quite literal birth scene, but like it's very mechanical and explains the potential like science behind it that Shelley didn't really get into in her book. And yeah, and also this there's another point about Victor being like positioned in the traditionally feminine role, with how he's like near hysterical and like obsessed with like he's like going through labor basically, like as he gets more intensely like just obsessed with getting this creation to happen. And I think that's especially dramatized in the film, even more so than in the novel. Depending on length, I might also dive into like the theme of maternal grief, and how the creature kind of evokes like that horror of maybe like a stillbirth or some kind of failed motherhood, which also echoes Shelley's personal experiences with grief. And then Branagh really like amplifies the melodrama of it, by externalizing what Shelley was only able to do, like was only able to symbolize in prose. And also like how both texts deal with the aftermath of the birth, the like rejection of the creature and how it mirrors the loss or rejection of a child that one gives birth to, like kind of that fear of like not connecting with one's child as they quote unquote should. And then the Lepore article also had some more information about Shelley's diary. I think it was a Lepore article, where she like Shelley had dreams that her baby came to life again after she had dealt with like I don't remember if it was a stillbirth or maybe like the baby died a little bit after birth. But yeah, just those like dreams and probably how that influenced Shelley to come up with this story. And also but both the novel and the film were very similar in how the monster pleads for, he's like pleased to be loved. And that's like an echo of the mother-child bond denied. So tying the comparison into like Halberstam's theory, and how she talked about like technology as the technology of monstrosity. So both Shelley and Branagh like depict the creation as it's as a site where gender and the body like collapse. Victor's experiment transforms the male ambition into like a grotesque imitation of motherhood. And this also exposes the instability of identity and the failure of masculine control over life and death. Also in Halberstam's framework, both of these texts like visualize how the Gothic horror externalizes maternal trauma through like bodily excess, and it reveals grief and creation as both as like inseparable acts of monstrosity. And finally, here are some secondary resources. I drew from Ellen Moore's Female Gothic, The Monster's Mother, quite a bit for this presentation. And then there's also the blog post by Jill Lepore, which goes more into like Shelley's life. But if I wanted to expand on this, I'd probably also dive more into Devin Hodges' article from 1983. And then there was also like, if I was maybe like teaching this, I would probably share the Carrie O'Shea blog post. It was a pretty interesting review on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And yeah, and that's all. So thanks for watching.